All right, people. So, welcome everybody to my talk about Back to the Future Whois, another great research project from the only mildly mad scientists who also brought you other amazing science like Can we replace multimode with copper? Darling, I put our university infrastructure into the cloud, and Should I surveil or should I not? How ready is DNS for an IPv6 only world? Thursday, 4 p.m. Central European Time here at this conference. Check it out. So, a big shout out to my co-authors, Florian Streibelt, Martina Lindorfer, Seda Gürses, and Carlos Hernandez Gañán. I am Tobias Fiebig, and I will be your guide. This whole project basically started with us trying to get a handle on how universities move to the cloud. With our box of tools containing the Farsight dataset, this problem quite quickly looked like a DNS entry-shaped nail, specifically a DNS entry under a university's domain pointing to an IP address-shaped problem, which sadly leaves one big problem. What the Farsight dataset gives us are names pointing to IP addresses. Now, what we really want to know, though, is who owns these addresses, or at least whose infrastructure do you reach when accessing an address under a name which belongs to a university's domain. Now, tying IP addresses to an organization is not that hard. Okay, granted, it is pretty hard, but on the course level, if you want to do it for just one address, this can be done relatively easily with a manual Whois. Type Whois $IP address, and if it's not legacy address space and the responsible address holder cared enough to fill up the corresponding IRR entries, you're good. Of course, using Whois for every single IP address is somewhat boring, and we have a dataset with around about 880 million DNS requests, boiling down to around 14 million unique IP addresses over nearly 8 years. That is a lot, and not really anything you want to keep typing manually. Luckily, there is a bulk Whois service run by Team Camry, which actually lets you just open up a socket to the service and pipe a list of addresses. And that's what we did. Turns out universities are actually really fond of using the cloud services. What we found is that nearly all the US and UK universities have at least one service under their domain that points to an IP address, ultimately ending up with one of the big three cloud providers. Checked up on a lot of other things as well, besides plain cloud use, of course, and the story is a bit more complex, with some countries being different, but that's not the core of our story here. If you want to learn more about how cloudification may also threaten your academic freedom, take a look at our paper on that side. In any case, after we successfully obtained some results, we submitted our paper, and then the inevitable thing of submitting papers happened. We got reviews. And as reviews go, they tend to bring up all those things you very forcefully ignored all while submitting the paper. And in our case, that was actually us using current Whois data to attribute addresses seen as far back as 2015. We naturally had thought about that and written some very smart excuses in the limitations section of our paper, guesstimating that the impact of IP address trading should be comparatively minor and decrease over time. Naturally, the reviewers did not really buy our explanation, and to be honest, in the end, the reviewers kind of had a point when they noticed that we just did not know whether it didn't have an impact. So we tried to find out. Looking for a way to make this happen, we thought about querying the RIPE database semi-manually, as it comes with historic data, but that is, again, relatively slow and boring, and RIPE only. This is when a reviewer helpfully pointed out that we could use the CIDA aggregates of the RouteViews project to do something very similar to what Team Camry is actually doing, only with the added benefit of going back in time. There also is a D4 project, which already operates such a Back to the Future-like service. However, their public service only goes back a few months, while using CIDA and RIS data. Hence, we set out to do what one does in such a situation and build our own toolchain to solve that problem. And what it does is actually pretty simple. We take the daily GRT extracts from CIDA, push them all into a big IP prefix tree, actually one for v4 and one for v6, and then we have a small API to query that. This also scales relatively well, as we can do per connection load balancing, and ultimately it allows us to spread the load over a whole cluster of virtual machines, all running one instance of the tree, keeping everything in memory. So with that in place, does it actually work? And yeah, it kind of does. To evaluate that, we took the dataset from our university measurement study and performed monthly IP address attribution for the, in summary, 150 million IPs, as we now unique them per month, over the duration of our study. And we compared that attribution we did with our Back to the Future Whois to what Team Camry would have said. And it somewhat looks like what we expected. We go from around 7.5% of prefixes being attributed, and prefixes here means /24s, being attributed differently down to less than 1% for the latest part of the data. All the while, most disagreement clusters heavily around just a few ASNs. So if you trade a /16 or a /8, of course, that will then later be announced by one ASN, and then you just have one of those big clusters. Big question though, what does it do to our data? So when we recalculated our graphs from the beginning, like the one you saw earlier, using the Back to the Future Whois data, we see that it actually does change the results we have. In fact, especially in the UK and the US, there is a considerable drop in measured Amazon usage in 2015 and right about until mid-2016. And especially for the UK, this leads to a highly different adoption curve, much steeper, for Amazon actually getting into that market, partially changing even our conclusions. When we dig into this a bit more, we see that this effect seems to be indeed most significant for Amazon. There's one outlier for Microsoft in 2015 and a bit of noise for Google, but ultimately what really changes the graph is a set of IP addresses ultimately attributed to Amazon, even though they were not Amazon at the time. This, of course, lets you wonder what happened. What happened is relatively easy. The answer, unsurprisingly, brings us to the beautiful town of Boston, not only known for their chowder, but also for universities whose full name I'm not willing to butcher trying to pronounce it on stream, selling major parts of a legacy /8 to Amazon. Back in 2015 and 2016, those addresses still belonged to MIT, and we wrongfully attributed them to Amazon because if you check today, they are fully integrated into the digital world of a spacefaring netizen. Of course, building something for yourself is boring, mostly because you use it just for one paper, and that's somewhat sad. So instead, we decided to set up our Back to the Future Whois service as a publicly available system. So flag up your IP addresses with the date you want, point to bttf.whois.as59645.net, port TCP 43, and go on a journey back to the future. By the way, this is part of a somewhat bigger project around building a measurement AS. That means a dedicated AS just for, well, mostly active measurements. Currently, we're just a tiny bit short of IPv4 space, so if you happen to know someone who has a spare /22, drop me a line. So I'm probably already running out of time, and I guess the first people from non-UTC-ish time zones have been bored enough by my monologue to fall asleep, so let's quickly conclude. In summary, if you work with a dataset that has been collected earlier than when you analyze it, or try to attribute addresses in it, right, when you do it, the name of the game is we have to go back to the future. Every year difference costs you roughly 1% accuracy, and depending on what exactly you are looking at, that 1% might hit in a spot where it actually impacts your conclusions quite heavily. So thank you for being in this talk, and if you have any questions or comments, or actually used our service, please drop me a line. Thank you.